Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. And this week, we've got a bit of a beef. We're angry, we're cross, and we want a bit of a battle. And we've chosen to battle with the most well-known financial guru in America. So, a pretty big battle then. It's going to be an interesting episode.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning, property investors come to be informed and inspired. Yes, this week we are picking a fight with Dave Ramsey, probably the biggest name in the US in personal finance, highly respected, and has done a lot of good for a lot of people. But he happens to have a view on property investing and mortgages in particular that we believe is completely wrong and will cost you vast amounts of money if you listen to it, and we're not going to let it stand. So make sure you stick around for this episode and stick around to the end for Hub Extra, where we've got a trio of great resources to share with you.
So a really interesting news story this week. The headline reads, Stamp duty holiday did not cause market frenzy. And that refers to what was probably fairly heated market that we've had recently. And it's been decided by experts that the stamp duty holidays had no impact whatsoever behind this current market frenzy that we're all experiencing. And this opinion comes from the think tank, the Resolution Foundation. And not only have they claimed that the stamp duty holiday didn't have any impact on this current frenzy, but they've also been quite critical of the stamp duty holiday. Rob, I'm interested. What do you make of this one?
I'm suspicious of their methods, but I agree with their conclusions, I think is the way I'd put it. The reason I'm suspicious is you could never know what would have happened in a situation that didn't happen, if you see what I mean. So there's no way they could run a simulation of the other version and actually say for sure what would have been the case. But the conclusion is convincing for two reasons. One being that they've said that they've broken it down by local authority, and in areas where house prices grew the most, those were the areas where, because of average house prices, the savings from the stamp duty holiday would have been the least. And also they correctly point to the fact that house prices have been going nuts all over the world, including in countries where they haven't done anything to stamp duty. So they claim that if we had not had the stamp duty holiday, then the government would have collected an extra 4.4 billion in tax that they've missed out on. So the policy was a bad idea. And in retrospect, that's probably right. But you've got to remember, the world was a very different place when that policy was announced. No one knew what was going to happen. In fact, zero people were predicting what has played out over the last year or 18 months. So I'd say it's hard to blame the government too much for putting that measure in place.
Yeah, I'd agree. It is hard to blame the government. I'm not going to disagree with the findings, but I do disagree with the binary nature of it, whereas complete impact or zero impact. And I think that it gave the market a bit of confidence early on. It made people aware of the market again. It gave people the awareness that actually, you know what, the property market might be worth considering. And the impact of stamp duty may have been a couple of months, maybe only weeks, before it was actually probably no longer needed anymore, and the fact that the market had got up and running. And I think it's a fair argument to say it would have got up and running by itself at some point anyway. But how much sooner did it get up and running because of the stamp duty? Again, it's one of those questions that can't be answered. I think the think tank's approach where it's all or nothing is a little unfair. I think there was probably a few extra transactions that took place because of the stamp duty, maybe transactions happening sooner because of the stamp duty. And that all or nothing approach, when looking at the tax revenues missed as well, I think is probably a little misleading. But it is really interesting. And we've talked about stamp duty a lot this year. And we've said that stamp duty ending wouldn't stall the market, which so many people predicted. And the market clearly didn't stall when stamp duty was wound down. And this leads us really nicely into next week, which is our market update episode. Because, of course, we're going to look at the market, what's happening right now, other factors that are in play that are really boosting the market. So make sure you join us for next week's episode, where we're going to get into stories like this and others like it in much more detail.
Well, next week we're going to be focusing on what's happening in the property market right now. But what can you achieve in property over a longer period of time? Well, that's the subject of our latest YouTube video, which has just been uploaded. The title is a tantalising one. It's how to turn £100,000 into £1 million using property. And that's not just clickbait. We actually model out with numbers how to make that happen. So head on over to YouTube, search Property Hub, make sure you subscribe to the channel and check that video out. One of the things we end up talking about more than anything else on the Property Podcast is mortgages or leverage, because it's such a powerful tool. In fact, we commonly say that using mortgages is like one of the superpowers that property investors have. We've talked about this multiple times over the years, but not everyone shares this view. And in fact, there's one extremely prominent radio personality in the US who has completely the opposite view. and says that mortgages for buying investment property should be avoided at all costs. So that sounds like something worth getting into. We're going to get into that debate in this episode, but if you listened to Ask Rob and Rob last Tuesday, you'll have heard the question from Katie that sparked this conversation off.
Hi, Rob and Rob. Thank you so much for your podcast. I absolutely love it. I would love to know your opinion on Dave Ramsey and the approach of buying investment property cash only, all cash. And can you give, if you had to give a list of positives of buying all cash, and then, of course, the kind of mathematical, financial negatives to that. But in your opinions, is there ever a time when buying cash is actually the better thing to do? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Katie. First of all, I think it's worth talking about who Dave Ramsey is. Because while he's massive in America, I mean massive, he's a huge personality figure in America, in the UK, he's not that well known. Think of Martin Lewis, but much bigger. This guy's scale is huge. He has his own radio show, his own podcast show. It's also filmed for YouTube. He's an author of multiple bestseller books, maybe even more than you, Rob. Surely not. He's a businessman. He's done a lot. And you know what? He has done a lot for people. The reason why he's such a well-known figure or celebrity in the US is because he has helped a lot of people. And he's helped them by becoming debt-free. And in America, there are a lot of people, just like the UK, who are in debt, probably more so in America. So because of all his teachings and his strict approach to finances, he's got a bit of a cult following. Rob, to give people an idea, what are some of the things that he teaches people?
Like you said, it's mostly based around getting people out of debt. So it's not necessarily about building wealth or taking what you've got and getting more. It's about getting out of a really difficult situation. I think where he's been so successful is he gives people a method to do that that's quite easy to understand, easy to follow. He gives people a step-by-step system and gives them encouragement to go through that process. So one of the things that he's best known for is what's called the debt snowball method, which is where if you've got lots of debts that you owe to different people, you pay off the ones with the lowest balances first, and then use the interest that you're not paying anymore towards those to start paying down future debts and so on until it's all gone. He also talks about budgeting in quite a structured way. So he talks about using the envelope system, which is basically where you have an allocation each month for food, entertainment, and so on. Keep them strictly segregated and only spend what's in that envelope to make sure that you don't get into more debt by overspending. He allows the use of debt to buy your own home as long as you pay it down as quickly as you possibly can. But he's against credit cards, and he's also against student debt, which of course is an issue in the UK, but is a far, far bigger issue in the US than it is here. So Rob, like you said, debt is a really big problem in the US. So by presenting a clear solution to that problem, it's obvious why he's developed the following he has.
Although we've kind of tried to make it obvious already, we haven't got an agenda against Dave Ramsey. We're not against all of his teachings. We agree with a lot of what he talks about. There's some really good stuff there. But he does have a view on investment property, or in the US, real estate. And this view is something that we do disagree with. We actually completely disagree with. So, Rob, what are his views when it comes to property investment?
Well, something that he's talked about quite a bit over the years, like on his radio show, podcast, it gets mentioned in his books. But to make sure that we're not misrepresenting his views, I'm taking some quotes from his website and an article that he's written called How to Invest in Real Estate. So I'm going to quote from that to give the most accurate possible version of his position. He says, "Before we jump in, let's make something crystal clear. You should pay for investment properties with 100% cash. Don't even think about getting into debt for a rental property. A 100% down payment takes debt out of the equation, lowers your risk, and sets you up to make more money a lot sooner." He then repeats something similar a little bit later on. He says, "Step 1, pay in cash. This flies in the face of most real estate investing advice. But the truth is, there is no such thing as good debt. No ifs, ands, or buts. Taking on debt always equals taking on risk, so avoid it no matter what." Then finally, there's another stipulation as well. He says later on in the same article, "You should invest in real estate only after you've already paid off your own home. That means you're completely debt-free with an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses saved." So, Rob, that's quite an extreme position. Get the emergency fund first, pay off your own home first, then after you've paid off your own home, pay for your entire portfolio in cash.
Yeah, obviously the people who listen to the Dave Ramsey show have, super well-paid jobs that can just hoover up property after property in cash. Obviously they don't, but that's why we have issue with this, because, well, let's just cut to it. We just think this is plain wrong. Before we talk about why we see this as wrong, let's talk about how Dave Ramsey expects people to save up for that investment property. Not deposit, remember, the whole amount plus the purchase costs in cash. So set a saving goal. Okay, fair enough. Start budgeting. So stop going to the gym, dining out for special occasions. Stop saving for retirement. Boost your income through Uber, teaching English, pet walking. And finally, while you're doing all that extra work, no longer going out for any meals, becoming a little bit larger because you're not going to the gym, you also get rid of your holidays and sell any unwanted things. Now, of course, okay, so there is some good advice in there. But the reason why you can hear possibly a mocking tone in my voice is doing a few extra Uber rides at the weekend, cancelling all your holidays, not going out for any meals, not going to the gym, could be a sacrifice that some people could take for a year, maybe a couple of years, doing all that extra work and foregoing a lifestyle. But realistically, it's going to take a long time before you've got that amount that you need to buy a property. You could be talking way over a decade, maybe a couple of decades. And by then, property prices may have surged forward while you're trying to save up, and you haven't seen the inside of a harvester and have no idea what the menu's looking like for a good 20 years. Now, I don't know, Rob, I love property investment, but if you told me I can't get the cellar bar of the harvester for 20 years, I might have to give it all up.
That's not a decision that anyone should be forced to make, let alone you. Now, just to be clear, a lot of those tips don't come from this specific article. They're taken from other things that he's written. But from the article that I quoted from, the title is How to Invest in Real Estate. If you're putting all those stipulations in place, then the answer is basically don't. Isn't it? I mean, we get so many questions on Ask Rob and Rob about how to save up for a deposit. And when we asked our community what's holding people back from investing in property, being able to save up enough money for deposits was by far the biggest obstacle that people talked about. And by saying, well, actually, you've got to save effectively 4 times more than that because you can't use any debt at all, it just makes it impossible for anyone who is not, let's face it, already wealthy.
Some of those tips might be useful, Rob, if you are saving up for a deposit and you're willing to take a shorter term sacrifice, and maybe it'll take a small number of years then, doing some of those methods we described, then yeah, fair enough. But as I said, this is not realistic. This is decades rather than years before you're going to get enough to be able to invest.
Yeah, you can't dog walk your way into building a property portfolio with cash. It's just not going to happen. We've talked before about how you've got to be careful about your mindset because saving and financial discipline is important, but you can only cut so far. And you get to a point where finding ways to make more money in a scalable kind of way by creating businesses, by creating intellectual property, things like that, are going to be far more powerful in terms of your wealth than just cutting back more and more. But to be fair, in his core point, he's not wrong. He says taking on debt always equals taking on risk. And he's right about that. Taking on debt does increase your risk. But then he goes on to say, so avoid it no matter what. And that's what I don't think is quite right. I think you've got to be aware of the risks, work out how you can control the risks, and then determine after thinking, okay, well, here's the risk. Here's what I could do to control it. Is this still a risk I'm happy taking? So we'll talk in a minute about how powerful mortgages are, which is a super important point. But first, let's tackle these risks. What are the risks of mortgages and what can you do to control them?
So there are a few reasons why he sees mortgages as risky, and all of them are understandable. So the first is that the value of property could decline. And if it declines, he says you lose money. But you don't lose money. You only lose it on paper. Only if you're forced to sell or you decide to sell that you will make money. And so many people forget this. It's a mental thing. Like if you buy a stock and it goes down by 10%, then you may feel like you've made a 10% loss, but only if you sell on that day. If you hold on for long enough, that stock may recover and go back in the positive direction. It's the same for property. Remember, property isn't anywhere near as volatile as stocks, but at some point in the future, property prices will take a turn for the worse. And some people will panic and sell. And yes, those people will lose money. Unfortunately, some people will be forced to sell, and those people will lose money. But if you're the ones who are choosing to sell, then it's your fault you're losing money, because if you hold on to it over the long term, as we've seen, over hundreds and hundreds of years, property goes up in value. So yes, you can lose money if you buy a property with a mortgage, if property prices decline, but only if you're forced to sell. And most people get a mortgage currently for buy-to-let at around 75% loan to value, which is basically that you get a mortgage for 75% of the value of the property. Now, let's say the day after you buy it, the market crashes. Well, will it crash more than 25%? Probably not. The last crash, the financial crisis, where the whole financial system nearly had a meltdown, we didn't have falls of 25%. It was around about 20%. So severe, but if you've bought with a 75% loan to value, then you still wouldn't be in negative equity. So also the amount of debt that you get on a property is important. The second thing he says is if your property doesn't produce income, you can't make the payments. So basically saying that if you suddenly have voids, then you can't pay your mortgage, which is true. So you can have an emergency fund, something that he talks about, something that we've talked about many, many times, that you should always have funds aside for a rainy day. You can also get rental guarantee insurance, RGI, if you're really worried. And realistically, if you're struggling to get a tenant, then it's normally for two reasons. One, your rental's too high, or two, your letting agent isn't very good. Now, both of those things are really easy to fix. You can drop the rent, and if it lets out really quickly, then the rent was too high. And if you drop the rent and that doesn't work, then try a different letting agent, and then hopefully you should be fine. At some point, dropping the rent enough will make it good value to someone. And the third thing he says is that if your mortgage payments go up because interest rates go up, then you could be making a loss. But buy-to-let mortgages undergo stress tests at the moment. And if you're worried about this, you can put yourself into a 5-year fix and lock in a low rate for a reasonable amount of time. But the stress tests that lenders take on your property when you take out finance are normally at interest rates of over 5%. And rates at the moment are half that. So again, there's plenty you can do to mitigate the risk of interest rates going up. So if you can get rid of those risks or reduce them quite a bit, this then brings us back to something we quoted earlier, which he said that buying cash, 100% down payment takes the debt out of the equation, lowers your risk and sets you up to make more money a lot sooner. So Rob, this is something that I know we massively disagree with. That, okay, yes, it could potentially lower your risk. You know what? Absolutely, it does lower your risk, but you can mitigate those risks, as we discussed. But sets you up to make more money a lot sooner buying cash is actually complete nonsense.
Yeah, of course it is, because why do people take on risk in the form of leverage? There is some form of risk by taking on a mortgage. You wouldn't do that if you're going to end up with less at the end of it. You only take on risk because you think you're going to end up making more, and you make that trade-off. So the idea that avoiding leverage would actually make you more money just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense in lots of different ways. So if you start with the most obvious, well, we've already talked about how long it takes to save up for a deposit. If you're not saving up for a deposit, you're saving up for the entire purchase. How many years could that take? I mean, it could take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. It's going to take a very, very, very long time. If you're doing that with the aim of saving up to buy a property specifically, then you don't want to be doing anything risky with that money. All you can really do is keep it in the bank, because if you put it in the stock market, then of course it could do very well, but then it could also not. And that's not a risk that you want to take with money that you're earmarking for another purpose. That should be an investment in its own right. So you're basically spending years and years and years with money that's sitting in the bank, not earning anything, in fact, becoming worth less because of inflation over the years, because you're taking such a long time to save up to buy an entire property in cash because you don't want to use leverage. I mean, this might sound extreme in the other direction, but I'd almost say if you're going to do that, don't bother investing in property. If it's going to take you a decade to save up to buy a property, which it could, and you're not going to get the benefits of leverage, which we're going to come to, then you probably end up further ahead by putting your money into the stock market on day one, keeping on putting it in as you save up more, and ending up making your gains there instead. But let's get on to the real power of mortgages. And this is really easy to illustrate with an example. So let's change it around a little bit and say that you've got enough cash that you could go and buy the average UK property in cash, or you could decide to use that same amount of cash with mortgages to buy more property. And let's go back and look at where you'd be today if you'd made both of those decisions 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, the average property in the UK cost £173,000. So you could have bought that property with cash, probably as a result of saving up since the 90s or something like that. But you could have done that. And then by today, that property would be worth £254,000, which is what the average property in the UK is worth right now. That is a gain of £81,000 or 46%. So you've made a 46% return on your money over the decade. So let's look at what would have happened if instead you'd have taken that £173,000 that you could have used and use it to buy £520,000 worth of property. Why that much? Well, because I'm taking £130,000 as a deposit and adding on taxes and fees. So this is not going to be precise. Actually, it's a little bit conservative, but let's say that that's what you did. Well, if you'd used mortgages to buy that £520,000 worth of property, today, based on the same growth rate, it would be worth £759,000. That is a gain of £239,000 or 138% of your original investment. So with leverage, you've made 138% over the decade. Without leverage, you've made 46%. That is a gigantic difference. 46% over a decade. It's really nothing special. I mean, it's not been a great decade for property. It's not been a terrible one either. It's been okay. But between 4 and 5% a year, you can go and get that in other asset classes with a lot less work. 138% over the decade is really, really good. And this is the entire point. Because you're using leverage, in other words, you're using the bank's money to buy more property than you'd otherwise be able to, you're getting whatever the gain is each year multiplied. So if you're only putting in a quarter of the money, you could say, well, you get that gain multiplied by 4. I actually cut it back and say you're multiplying it by 3 because you've got all your stamp duty and everything else to take account of. But what that means is even if you've got a really nothingy year for property, if it just goes up in value by 2%, which is in line with what inflation is supposed to be, well, then if you're using leverage, you're effectively making a gain of 6%, which is pretty good even when property is only going up by a couple of percent. And occasionally when you get those real blockbuster years like the one we're in at the moment, where you might have property going up by 7-8% a year, well, you can start getting up towards a 20% annual return purely because of the benefit of leverage. And remember that you're also collecting more rental income each month. We've not even talked about rental income yet. So this whole notion that you make more by buying in cash is not true on the income side either. Obviously, it depends on the amount of rent that's coming in and your mortgage rate and things like that. But generally, you'd expect to be bringing in more rental income from 3 properties, even after paying your mortgages, than you would be from 1. So you make more money each month. You start making that money sooner because you're investing far sooner. And then you get to multiply the capital growth that you make, which, as we've just seen, over a decade or even longer, starts to make an absolutely astronomical difference. I don't see how there's any case for you being better off buying in cash. And yes, you're taking a bit less risk by buying in cash. But is that risk worth taking? Well, for benefits like that, personally, I'm up for taking a bit of controlled risk.
So let's bring this all together now. Put simply, if you're not using debt, mortgages, leverage, then you're foregoing a property investor's most powerful tool. It really does supercharge your investment. This isn't some bias because we're the property podcast. It's there for you to listen to. Rob's just done a great job of explaining it. If you want to see something visual, then check out our free course on propertyhub.net. It's called How Property Will Make You Rich Over the Long Term. It explains all the things that will make you wealthy over the long term, and leverage is a big part of that. So go and check that course out if you've not watched it already. As I said, it's completely free. You just need to sign up for a membership, which obviously is free. So make sure you do that. I think it's also worth noting that it's actually really risky doing what Dave Ramsey has suggested, because you are not diversified at all. Let's say you save up enough for a property and that property is 150k. And then that one property turns out to be a dud. Well, all those years you've put in saving for that one property means that you are now really exposed. As a deposit down on that property, you're reasonably exposed. But you've saved for years and years and years. You've made this big bet that this is your financial future. And if it doesn't go right, then it's going to take a while for you to save up for that next one. And you'll probably be put off for property for life. Whereas if your first investment doesn't go so well with a deposit, then hopefully your second one won't be as bad. Property investment is tough. Things go wrong. And by having a portfolio, by having more properties, it balances your risk. That said, you probably should consider something else if you're only going to buy cash and you have to save up to buy the cash. Fair enough if you've got a massive cash pot already and you want to buy cash and you don't want to take advantage of leverage, that's fine. But if you have to save up for it, then you may as well just do stocks or bonds or one of the many other investments that are available out there, rather than waiting year upon year to save up for that deposit. Because the opportunity cost of you not investing over all those years is huge.
And that opportunity cost that you mentioned is particularly important when you're young. When you're young, you can take on the most risk, you're the most resilient, but also you want to compound your money. Because if you haven't got much money, then you want to compound that as rapidly as you can, have the most time available for that compounding to take effect to get you to the place that you need to be. And if you're spending all that time actually not taking on any risk at the point in your life when you're best able to take on risk, then you're missing that opportunity and you're not compounding your money at all. Now, we've touched on this already, but it's worth saying that the cash-only method will make sense for some people. If you're in a position where you've got a ton of cash already, and maybe you're a bit older and all you want to do is park that cash somewhere, put it somewhere where it can generate a steady return and it's going to be relatively safe, then buying with cash is an entirely sensible thing to do. And there's no point taking on any kind of extra risk for more return because you don't need or want that extra return. That's fine. But if you're using property to grow your wealth rather than just park your wealth, then leverage, as we've already seen, is a key ingredient, as is being able to invest sooner rather than later. In general, caution is good. And of course, there are plenty of people who've lost huge amounts of money by not being cautious, by taking on far too much risk, by not controlling that risk and ending up losing everything and ending up in really terrible situations. But there is such a thing as being so careful, you never get anywhere. You're not willing to take on any kind of calculated risks. And as a result, you don't make any progress. You could definitely end up not winning as a result of being afraid to lose. And for me, Rob, what's happening here is that Dave is presenting a very black and white picture, which is completely consistent with his overall message, but he's overextending his general message to a point where it just doesn't really work. The general point about budgeting, getting out of debt, getting rid of really damaging debt like credit card debt, makes total sense. And maybe to keep that message simple and powerful and make sure people don't get the wrong idea and just keep banging the same drum, which obviously works for thousands and thousands of people, he's decided to just stick with that and just say, no, this applies to absolutely everything, including investment property, even though it doesn't really make sense, as we've just said. Or it could also be that Dave Ramsey himself went bankrupt when he was in his 20s or 30s as a result of property debt. Now, it's completely different. He was using very short-term development loans, which then got called in at short notice. He wasn't able to repay them, and he ended up losing everything. So it's possible that it's actually as a result of his own experience that he's got this bias. And even though the context is completely different, it's just given him this view of mortgages are bad. But whatever the reason is, whether it's to do with his own experience or whether it's to keep his message simple, in the context of using mortgages sensibly for long-term property investment, it's very blinkered to say that you shouldn't use them at all. And it's completely wrong to say that you end up making more money if you invest in cash, because as we've proven, you absolutely don't.
No, you don't. The reason we've tackled this episode is for two reasons. People like Katie may come across this information and think, well, Dave Ramsey, he's a well-regarded figure. He must be right. Well, he's not. And that's why we've had to tackle it, because we do get people on a fairly regular basis contact us saying, right, I'm going to invest in property and I want to buy cash. And you know what? In the majority of cases, it's not because they've got tens of millions that they just don't really want to bother with leverage at all. It's because they've got enough to do one, maybe two. They're in that lucky position. And they're just fearful of debt. And they don't understand the numbers. So yes, this episode will help anyone who listens to the podcast and also consumes Dave Ramsey's information. But also, hopefully more importantly, it's helped those of you listening who want to buy in cash and don't fully understand leverage. Hopefully this episode's gone a long way to helping you realise that not only should you be not fearful of mortgages, that actually you should be really excited and motivated to use mortgages and leverage.
Just before we wrap up this week's episode, we've got time for Hub Extra. It's that part of the show where we send you on your way with a little bit more, a book, a resource, a quote, something to think about, whatever it is to make your life a little bit better. And then we back it up with the Hub Extra email that Property Hub members, and remember it's completely free, receive in their inbox every Friday morning. And this week we've actually got a Hub Extra triple up. We've got a trio of resources to help you explore some of the ideas in this episode a little bit more. So the first of those is the Meaningful Money podcast by a good friend of the show, Pete Matthew. It's a really great podcast that goes into lots of different aspects of money and personal finance. It covers different types of investment, it covers budgeting and some of the ideas that we've talked about in this episode, so you can go and explore those a little bit more. Another resource to get a different perspective from the one that Dave Ramsey shares is Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Now, won't talk about this much because we've talked about it plenty on the podcast in the past, but that book is very much about the concept of good debt and bad debt, whereas Dave Ramsey says there is only bad debt. So if you haven't read that book or you haven't done so in a while, well worth doing. So you're not just taking our word for the fact that there is such a thing as good debt. And finally, a book that we've also talked about on the show before, but not for a really long time. It's a book by MJ DeMarco that's called Millionaire Fastlane. And it is a cheesy title. It's a bit of a cheesy book, but it does a really good job of explaining something that we talked about earlier in the episode, which is to do with the concept of building your wealth and creating more money rather than just saving and cutting back to almost nothing. It puts that idea across really powerfully, and it's a very entertaining read. So if you want to explore some of the ideas in this episode from different angles, all of those resources, well worth checking out.
They certainly are. And you know what else will be worth checking out? Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday, because of course it's back then. And we'll be back with the main event, the Property Podcast, on Thursday. So until then, take care, everyone. Have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.